Karoline Leavitt had been dreaming of this moment for years. Ever since she was a young girl glued to the TV screen, watching The View with her mom, she'd imagined herself sitting at that iconic round table, sharing her thoughts with millions of viewers. It wasn't just about fame or recognition. It was about having a platform to speak her truth. And now here she was, walking into the studio as a guest panelist. Her heart raced, but she tried to stay calm. This was her big break. As she stepped onto the set, the bright lights and buzzing energy hit her all at once. The crew was scurrying around, adjusting cameras and microphones, while the familiar faces of the co-hosts greeted her warmly. She shook hands with each of them, smiling nervously. But when she turned to face Whoopi Goldberg, something inside her tightened. Whoopi wasn't just any celebrity. She was sharp, fearless, and known for her quick wit. Karoline knew this wouldn't be an ordinary chat. She took her seat at the table, smoothing out her dress as the director counted down to go live. 5, 4, 3. The red light on the camera blinked, signaling they were on air. The opening jokes and banter flowed easily, and Karoline found herself relaxing a little. They talked about her career, her recent articles, and even some funny behind-the-scenes stories from her time as a journalist. For a moment, it felt like everything was going smoothly. But then, the conversation took a turn. One of the hosts casually brought up religion, mentioning how faith often plays a role in shaping people's worldviews. Karoline nodded along, knowing this topic would eventually come up. After all, she was open about being a devout Christian, and her beliefs were a big part of who she was. She expected questions, maybe even mild curiosity, but nothing could have prepared her for what happened next. Whoopi leaned forward in her chair, resting her elbows on the table. There was a playful glint in her eye, the kind that said, "I'm about to stir the pot." With a smirk, she turned to Karoline and said, "So you really believe all that God has a plan stuff? Like, seriously?" The audience erupted into laughter, their chuckles filling the room. Karoline froze for half a second, unsure if she should laugh along or take it seriously. She opted for a polite smile and replied, "Absolutely, I do. My faith is what keeps me grounded and gives me hope, especially during tough times." Whoopi tilted her head, clearly not satisfied with such a straightforward answer. "Hope, huh? You're telling me you think there's some guy in the sky pulling strings down here? Doesn't that sound, well, kinda crazy?" She delivered, the line with perfect comedic timing, drawing another wave of laughter from the crowd. Karoline felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She glanced at the other hosts, who seemed amused but also curious to see how she'd respond. Taking a deep breath, she reminded herself why she was there, not to win arguments, but to share her perspective authentically. She looked directly at Whoopi and said, "It might seem crazy to some people, but for me it makes perfect sense. Faith isn't about logic, it's about trust." Her response earned a few nods from the audience, but Whoopi wasn't done yet. She raised an eyebrow and fired back, "Trust, okay, but let's be real. If God's so great, why doesn't he just fix everything already? Why all the suffering?" The room grew quieter this time, though scattered giggles still lingered. Karoline hesitated for a split second, choosing her words carefully. "That's a question a lot of people ask," she admitted. "And honestly, I don't have all the answers. What I do know is that my faith helps me find meaning in the chaos. It reminds me that even when things feel broken, there's still purpose." Whoopi grinned, clearly enjoying the challenge. "Purpose, got it. So you're saying we're supposed to just sit back and wait for this purpose to reveal itself? Sounds like a lot of wishful thinking to me." Each jab landed with precision, pushing Karoline further into uncharted territory. Yet instead of shrinking under the pressure, she found herself growing more determined. She realized this wasn't just about defending her beliefs. It was about showing the world that faith wasn't something to ridicule. It was real, raw, and deeply personal. And as the segment continued, she braced herself for whatever came next, knowing this conversation was far from over. As the conversation unfolded, Karoline could feel the tension rising. Whoopi's playful tone was starting to edge toward something more pointed, and the audience seemed eager to see where this would lead. Karoline knew she couldn't just sit there and nod politely anymore. She had to dig deeper if she wanted to hold her ground. Whoopi leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms with a smirk. "All right, let me ask you this," she said, her voice dripping with skepticism. "If God's so powerful, why doesn't he stop bad things from happening? Like, I'm talking about wars, diseases, natural disasters, the big stuff. Why does he let all that happen?" The audience murmured in agreement, clearly intrigued by the question. It was a classic argument against faith, one that had been debated for centuries. But for Karoline, it wasn't just a philosophical discussion, it was personal. She thought about her own struggles, the moments when life felt unbearable and unfair. Those were the times when her faith had been tested the most, but also when it had proven to be her lifeline. She took a deep breath before responding, choosing her words carefully. "I think suffering is one of the hardest parts of believing in God," she admitted. "It's easy to say God has a plan when everything's going well, but when tragedy strikes, it gets complicated. I've been through my share of pain, and I won't pretend to understand why certain things happen. What I do know is that my faith gives me strength to keep moving forward." Her voice softened as she continued. "There's a verse in the Bible that says we walk by faith, not by sight. For me, that means trusting even when I don't have all the answers. It's not always easy, but it's what keeps me going." The room fell silent for a moment, the laughter fading into thoughtful reflection. Even Whoopi seemed briefly taken aback by the sincerity in Karoline's response. But then, almost instinctively, she bounced back with another jab. "Okay, fair. Enough," she said, raising an eyebrow. "But come on, you're telling me you actually talked to God? Like out loud? Doesn't that feel a little weird?" The audience erupted into laughter again, some people clapping as if they'd just witnessed a punchline. Karoline forced a smile, though she could feel the pressure mounting. This wasn't just about defending her beliefs anymore. It was about showing that faith wasn't something to mock. It was real, raw, and deeply human. "I do talk to God," Karoline replied firmly, meeting Whoopi's gaze without flinching. "And no, it doesn't feel weird to me. In fact, it's one of the most comforting things I've ever experienced. Prayer isn't about getting instant answers or magical fixes. It's about connection. It's about pouring out your heart, whether you're celebrating, grieving, or just confused." Whoopi tilted her head, clearly amused but also slightly intrigued. "Connection, huh? So you're saying God talks back to you? Or is it just a one-way street?" Karoline chuckled softly, easing the tension a bit. "Well, it's not like hearing a voice from the sky," she explained. "For me, God speaks through peace in the middle of chaos, through people who show up when I need them most, or sometimes just through a quiet reassurance that everything will work out. It's hard to explain unless you've felt it yourself." Her honesty caught the audience off guard. A few people nodded along while others exchanged curious glances. Whoopi, however, wasn't ready to let up. She leaned forward again, her eyes narrowing playfully. All right. Let's say I buy all this for a second. How do you know it's God and not just your own mind trying to make sense of things?" "This time," Karoline hesitated. It was a valid question, one she'd wrestled with herself many times. She thought about the countless nights she'd spent questioning her beliefs, searching for proof that went beyond emotions or intuition, and yet every time doubt crept in, something inside her reminded her of the moments that couldn't be explained away. "You know," she began slowly, "there are moments in life that are too specific, too meaningful to dismiss as coincidence. Like when I lost someone close to me a few years ago. I was devastated, angry even. But during that time, strangers showed up at my door with food, friends called out of the blue to check on me, and I found comfort in the smallest, most unexpected ways. It was like the universe, or maybe God, was wrapping me in love when I needed it most." Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke, emotion creeping into her words. The audience, once rowdy with laughter, now sat quietly, hanging on every word. Even Whoopi seemed momentarily disarmed, her usual quick wit giving way to a rare flicker of vulnerability. But just as quickly as the mood shifted, Whoopi snapped back into character. With a grin, she quipped, "Wow, okay, that's heavy, but Honestly, if I started talking to thin air, I'd probably end up locked in a padded room. The audience laughed again, breaking the spell. Karoline managed a polite chuckle, though she couldn't shake the feeling that this debate was heading somewhere bigger than either of them anticipated. She glanced around the table, noticing how the other hosts were watching intently, their expressions a mix of curiosity and admiration. Deep down, Karoline realized this wasn't just about winning over Whoopi or the audience. It was about staying true to herself. No matter how many jokes were thrown her way, she refused to let her faith be reduced to a punchline. And as the segment carried on, she braced herself for whatever came next, knowing that sometimes the toughest conversations lead to the most profound breakthroughs. As the segment rolled on, Karoline could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Whoopi's jokes kept coming, one after another, each one sharper than the last. The audience was still laughing, but it wasn't the same kind of laughter anymore. It had shifted. Less playful, more probing. People weren't just entertained, they were curious. They wanted to see how far this exchange would go and whether Karoline would crack under the pressure. Whoopi leaned forward again, resting, her chin on her hand as if she were about to deliver the final blow. "All right," she said, her tone teasing but with a hint of seriousness. "Let me ask you this. If God's so good, why does he let bad stuff happen to good people? Like, really think about it. Why should anyone keep believing when life keeps throwing punches?" The room went quiet for a split second, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. Karoline felt her heart skip a beat. This wasn't just a hypothetical scenario. It was a deeply personal issue that hit close to home. She thought about all the times she'd questioned her own faith, especially during the darkest moments of her life. She'd been there, sitting in the wreckage of shattered dreams, wondering if God even cared. But somehow she'd always found her way back to belief. And now, here she was, being asked to explain it all in front of millions. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before speaking. "You're right," she began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Life can be brutal. I've lost people I loved, faced situations where I felt completely powerless, and asked myself the exact same question. Why does God let these things happen?" The audience leaned in, their attention fully captured. Even Whoopi seemed to soften, slightly, sensing that Karoline wasn't just reciting rehearsed answers, she was sharing something real. "I don't have all the answers," Karoline continued, her gaze fixed on Whoopi, "but what I do know is that my faith has taught me how to find hope in the middle of pain. When everything feels broken, it reminds me that I'm not alone. There's something bigger than me holding it all together, even if I can't see it." Her words carried a weight that silenced the room. For a moment, no one laughed, no one whispered. It was as if everyone collectively held their breath, waiting to see what would come next. Whoopi raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued but unwilling to let the tension dissolve too quickly. "Hope, huh?" she said, leaning back in her chair. "That's a nice idea and all, but isn't it kinda, I don't know, wishful thinking? Like hoping doesn't change anything. Action does." Karoline nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth in Whoopi's statement. "You're absolutely right," she replied. "Hope by itself won't fix the world. But it gives you the strength to take action, to keep fighting even when it feels impossible. My faith doesn't mean I sit around waiting for miracles. It means I roll up my sleeves and try to be part of the solution because I believe in a higher purpose." Whoopi tilted her head, considering this response. "Higher purpose, okay. But again, how do you know it's real? How do you know it's not just your brain trying to make sense of chaos?" This time, Karoline didn't hesitate. She looked directly at Whoopi, her eyes filled with conviction. "Because I've lived through moments where logic couldn't explain what happened. Like when my best friend passed away suddenly and I didn't know how I'd survive. I prayed every night, not asking for answers, just begging for peace. And somehow it came. Not overnight, not magically, but little by little, I started healing. People showed up exactly when I needed them, opportunities opened up out of nowhere, and I realized I wasn't carrying the weight alone." Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, raw emotions spilling into her words. The audience sat frozen, captivated by the vulnerability in her tone. Some wiped tears from their eyes while others exchanged knowing glances. Even Whoopi, who prided herself on staying unshakable, seemed momentarily caught off guard. "Well," Whoopi said finally, breaking the silence with a wry smile, "I'll give you this, you've got guts. Most people would have crumbled by now." Karoline chuckled softly, relief washing over her. "Trust me, I've had plenty of moments where I wanted to crumble, but every time I did, my faith pulled me back up. It's not about having all the answers, it's about trusting that there's a reason, even if we can't see it yet." The audience erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the studio. It wasn't the kind of applause that comes from watching a heated debate. It was deeper, more heartfelt. People weren't just clapping for Karoline's courage. They were resonating with her story, her honesty, her humanity. But Whoopi wasn't done yet. Just as the applause began to die down, she leaned forward once more, her expression mischievous. "All right, last question," she said, her tone light but with a spark of curiosity. "If God's so amazing, why doesn't he prove himself? Like, why doesn't he show up in a big way and say, 'Hey, I'm here'? Wouldn't that solve everything?" The audience chuckled nervously, unsure whether to laugh or brace themselves for another emotional response. Karoline took a moment to gather her thoughts, realizing this was her chance to leave a lasting impression. She looked around the table, then back at Whoopi, her voice calm but unwavering. "Maybe he already has," she said simply. Not in some grand, flashy way, but in the small, quiet moments that remind us we're loved. In the kindness of strangers, the beauty of nature, the resilience of the human spirit. Maybe God's presence isn't meant to be obvious, it's meant to be felt. Her words hung in the air, lingering long after she finished speaking. The room fell silent again, the kind of silence that speaks louder than any applause. Whoopi stared at her, her usual quick wit momentarily replaced by something else. Thoughtfulness, perhaps, or even admiration. For a brief moment, it felt like the entire world had paused, holding its breath as two vastly different perspectives collided. And though neither woman walked away convinced of the other's point of view, something profound had shifted. The silence that followed Karoline's last statement was deafening. It wasn't the kind of quiet that happens when someone runs out of things to say. It was heavier, charged with emotion and unspoken thoughts. Whoopi sat there, her usual confident smirk replaced by an almost unreadable expression. For a split second it looked like she might laugh or crack another joke, but instead, she just stared at Karoline, as if trying to process what had just been said. "Maybe he already has," Karoline repeated softly, breaking the stillness in the room. Her voice carried a calm certainty, even though her hands were trembling slightly under the table. She could feel every eye on her, the audience, the camera crew, the other hosts. But none of that mattered anymore. This wasn't about performing. It was about sharing something deeply personal. And somehow she knew that this moment would define the entire conversation. Whoopi blinked, finally breaking her gaze. "All right," she said slowly, drawing out the word. There was no sarcasm in her tone this time, no playful jab waiting to follow. Just curiosity. "So, let me get this straight. You're saying God shows up in the little things? Like random acts of kindness or whatever?" Karoline nodded, relief washing over her now that the tension seemed to ease slightly. "Exactly," she replied. "Think about it. How many times have you gone through something tough and then suddenly someone says or does exactly what you needed to hear? Or maybe you find peace in a place you didn't expect, like watching a sunset or hearing your favorite song at just the right moment. Those aren't accidents to me. They're reminders that we're never truly alone." The audience murmured in agreement, some nodding along while others exchanged thoughtful glances. Even the other co-hosts, who had mostly stayed quiet during the back and forth, leaned forward in their seats, clearly intrigued by where the conversation was heading. One of them chimed in gently, "That's actually really beautiful. I think most people can relate to those moments whether they believe in God or not." Whoopi raised an eyebrow at this, clearly not ready to concede anything just yet. Beautiful or not, it's still pretty vague, she countered, her tone lighter but still probing. I mean, couldn't those moments just be coincidence? Or luck? Or even science explaining why we feel certain ways? Karoline smiled faintly, appreciating the challenge. Sure, you could call it coincidence, she admitted. But for me, faith is about choosing to see those moments differently. Instead of writing them off as random, I choose to believe they're part of something bigger. It's like looking at the stars. You can either see them as scattered dots in the sky, or you can connect them and find constellations. Faith helps me connect the dots. The metaphor caught everyone off guard, including Whoopi. For a brief second, she looked genuinely surprised, as if she hadn't expected such a poetic response. The audience erupted into applause again, their cheers filling the studio with energy. But this time, it wasn't just polite clapping. It felt like genuine appreciation for the depth of the exchange. Whoopi held up a hand, signaling for the audience to quiet down. When the noise settled, she turned back to Karoline, her playful grin returning. Okay, you're good, she said, shaking her head with a mix of amusement and admiration. You've got your whole speech thing down pat. But here's the real question. What happens when life throws you a curveball so big that even your constellations don't make sense anymore? Like, what if everything falls apart and nothing fixes it? It was the toughest question yet, and Karoline felt her chest tighten. She didn't have to think too hard to answer. It was a question she'd wrestled with countless times in her own life. She thought about the nights she'd spent crying herself to sleep, wondering if her faith was enough to carry her through. She thought about the pain of losing loved ones, the frustration of unanswered prayers, the moments when doubt threatened to swallow her whole. I won't lie to you, she began, her voice steady despite the weight of her emotions. There are days when it feels like nothing makes sense, days when I want to give up because the pain is too much. But even in those moments, my faith doesn't leave me. It reminds me that I don't have to have all the answers right now. Sometimes, it's okay to just sit in the mess and trust that healing will come eventually. Her honesty struck a chord with everyone in the room. The audience sat silently, hanging on to her every word. Some wiped away tears, while others nodded in quiet understanding. Even Whoopi seemed momentarily speechless, her usual quick wit taking a back seat to genuine reflection. After a long pause, Whoopi broke the silence with a soft chuckle. Man, you're making me rethink my whole stance on this, she joked, though there was a hint of sincerity in her voice. Not gonna lie, you're way better at this than I thought you'd be. Karoline laughed nervously, grateful for the light-hearted comment. Well, I'm not trying to convince anyone to believe what I believe, she said honestly. I just want people to understand that faith isn't about having perfect answers. It's about finding hope when everything else feels hopeless. And honestly, I think everyone needs a little bit of that, no matter what they believe. The audience erupted into applause once more, this time louder and more heartfelt than before. People weren't just clapping for Karoline. They were cheering for the message she represented: resilience, hope, and the courage to stand firm in your beliefs, even when faced with skepticism. As the segment drew to a close, the host wrapped things up with a few final remarks, thanking both Karoline and Whoopi for their lively discussion. But as the cameras cut to commercial, the energy in the room remained electric. Backstage, staff members approached Karoline, congratulating her on handling such a challenging situation with grace and authenticity. Meanwhile, Whoopi lingered near the table, sipping her coffee and glancing over at Karoline occasionally. Though she didn't say much, there was a subtle shift in her demeanor, a newfound respect perhaps for someone who refused to back down, but did so with kindness and conviction. By the end of the day, clips of the exchange had gone viral online, sparking debates and discussions across social media platforms. Viewers praised Karoline for her poise and admired Whoopi for pushing her to dig deeper. While opinions varied widely, one thing was clear. This wasn't just another talk show segment. It was a moment that resonated with people on a deeply human level. And as Karoline left the studio that evening, she couldn't help but smile. She hadn't set out to change anyone's mind or win an argument. All she wanted was to share her truth, and in doing so, she'd reminded the world that faith, hope, and connection are universal languages that speak to the heart, no matter where you come from or what you believe. The moment the cameras stopped rolling, the studio felt like a completely different place. The buzz of excitement lingered in the air, but it was quieter now, less about performance and more about reflection. Karoline took a deep breath as she stood up from the table, her legs feeling slightly shaky after the emotional roller coaster she'd just been on. She glanced around, catching snippets of conversation from the crew and staff members who were busy packing up equipment or chatting among themselves. Some gave her approving nods while others whispered to each other, clearly impressed by how she'd handled herself. As she made her way backstage, one of the producers approached her with a warm smile. "That was incredible," he said sincerely. "You held your ground against Whoopi, and trust me, that's no small feat. People are going to be talking about this for days." Karoline thanked him, though she still felt a mix of emotions swirling inside her. On one hand, she was proud of staying true to herself and sharing her perspective authentically. On the other hand, she couldn't shake the nervous energy that came with knowing millions of people had just watched her defend something so deeply personal. Would they understand where she was coming from? Or would they dismiss her as naive or overly idealistic? Before she could dwell too much on those thoughts, another staff member handed her a phone. "It's your mom," they said with a knowing grin. Karoline laughed softly. It figured her mom would call right after the show. She accepted the phone gratefully, stepping into a quieter corner of the hallway. "Honey, I'm so proud of you," her mom gushed before Karoline could even say hello. "Did you see the way you handled yourself out there? That was amazing." Karoline chuckled, leaning against the wall. "Thanks, Mom. Honestly, I wasn't sure if I was doing okay until it was over. Whoopi really kept me on my toes." "Well, that's what makes it so impressive," her mom replied. "You didn't crumble under pressure, you stood tall. And you did it with grace. I know your dad would have been proud too." At the mention of her late father, Karoline felt a lump rise in her throat. Her dad had been the one to teach her about faith when she was young, always encouraging her to ask questions and seek answers. He used to tell her, "Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting even when you don't." Hearing her mom reference him now brought tears to her eyes, but they were good tears, the kind that reminded her why she believed in the first place. After hanging up with her mom, Karoline took a few minutes to collect herself. Back in the foyer, green room snacks and drinks were laid out for the guests, but she wasn't hungry. Instead, she found herself replaying the conversation with Whoopi in her mind. There were moments she wished she'd phrased things differently, times when she wondered if she'd come across as defensive or too emotional. But overall, she knew she'd done her best, and that was enough. Just then, the door opened, and Whoopi walked in. Karoline looked up, surprised to see her. For a second, neither of them said anything. Then Whoopi broke the silence with a casual wave. "Hey," she said, plopping down onto the couch next to Karoline. "You handled yourself pretty well out there." Karoline blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected compliment. Thanks," she stammered. "I have to admit you kept me on edge the whole time." Whoopi chuckled, shaking her head. "Yeah, well, that's kind of my thing. Keeps things interesting, doesn't it?" They both laughed, the tension from earlier melting away. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, sipping bottled water and glancing at the TV monitors playing reruns of the day's episodes. Finally, Whoopi turned to Karoline, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she began, her tone softer than it had been during the interview. "I gotta say, I didn't expect you to stick to your guns like that. Most people get flustered when I push back, but you stayed steady. That takes guts." Karoline smiled, feeling a swell of gratitude. "Thank you," she said honestly. "To be fair, you pushed me to think harder about what I believe. I don't think I would have said half the things I did without your questions." Whoopi raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Oh, so now you're giving me credit for your big speech? Nice try." They both laughed again, the playful banter easing any lingering awkwardness. But beneath the humor, there was a mutual respect forming between them. Whoopi may not have walked away convinced of Karoline's beliefs, but she clearly admired her courage and sincerity, and Karoline, for her part, appreciated Whoopi's willingness to challenge her, not just for the sake of debate, but because it forced her to articulate her faith in a way she hadn't before. After a few more minutes of chatting, Whoopi stood up, stretching lazily. "All right, kiddo, I've got places to be," she said with a wink. "But seriously, good job out there, you earned it." "Thanks," Karoline replied, standing to shake her hand. "And hey, maybe we can do this again, sometime, keep the conversation going." Whoopi smirked, heading toward the door. "Don't push your luck," she called over her shoulder, laughing as she disappeared down the hallway. Once she was alone again, Karoline sank back onto the couch, letting out a long sigh. It had been an exhausting day, but also incredibly rewarding. As she scrolled through her phone, she noticed notifications pouring in from friends, family, and even strangers who had seen the segment. Messages of support flooded her inbox, along with comments praising her poise and authenticity. Social media was buzzing with clips of the exchange. Hashtags like Boss, Faith on the View, and Dans Courage over Criticism trending across platforms. One message stood out to her, a note from a young woman who wrote, "I've struggled with my own faith lately, but hearing you talk today reminded me why I started believing in the first place. Thank you for being brave enough to share your truth." Reading those words brought tears to Karoline's eyes. This was why she'd agreed to go on the show. Not for fame or recognition, but to connect with people and remind them that faith is a journey, not a destination. Whether someone agreed with her or not, she hoped her story might inspire others to hold on to hope even in the toughest moments. By the time she left the studio, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the city streets. Karoline paused, outside the building, taking a moment to breathe in the cool evening air. She thought about everything that had happened that day, the laughter, the challenges, the vulnerability, and realized something important. Faith isn't just about believing in God, it's about believing in yourself, in your ability to face whatever life throws your way, and in the power of connection to bridge divides. As she walked to her car, she couldn't help but smile. Win or lose, skeptic or believer, she knew one thing for certain. She'd stayed true to who she was, and sometimes that's the bravest thing you can do. The next morning, Karoline woke up to a flood of notifications on her phone. Her social media accounts were blowing up with messages, comments, and shares from people who had seen the clip of her conversation with Whoopi. It was overwhelming, but in the best possible way. People weren't just reacting to the exchange, they were sharing their own stories, opening up about their struggles with faith, doubt, and hope. Some praised her for standing firm, while others admitted they didn't share her beliefs but respected how she handled herself under pressure. One message caught her eye. A man wrote, "I'm not religious at all, but I watched your interview yesterday and something you said stuck with me. Faith is about finding peace even when life doesn't make sense." That really hit home for me. Thanks for saying what needed to be said. Karoline read the comment over and over again, feeling a lump form in her throat. This wasn't about convincing people to believe what she believed. It was about creating space for meaningful conversations, and judging by the responses pouring in, it seemed like she'd done exactly that. Later that day, as she scrolled through news articles and online forums discussing the segment, she noticed something interesting. While many viewers applauded her courage, others criticized her for engaging in such a public debate about faith. Some argued that religion shouldn't be debated on a talk show, while others accused her of being too emotional or defensive. First, the negative feedback stung, but then she remembered something her dad used to say. Not everyone will understand your journey, and that's okay. What matters is staying true to yourself. She decided to focus on the positive impact the conversation had made, rather than dwell on the criticism. After all, no discussion about faith or anything deeply personal was ever going to please everyone. What mattered most was that she'd sparked dialogue, encouraged reflection, and reminded people that faith wasn't a one-size-fits-all concept. For some, it was about God. For others, it might be about trust, resilience, or simply holding on to hope during tough times. A few days later, The View aired its follow-up episode, and Whoopi addressed the viral moment briefly. Sitting at the round table, she leaned forward with her trademark smirk and said, "So apparently my little chat with Karoline last week blew up the internet. Go figure." The audience laughed, clearly still invested in the story. Whoopi paused, glancing around the table before continuing. "Look, I'll admit, I didn't expect her to hold her ground like that. She came prepared and she didn't back down. I respect that. Do I agree with everything she said? Nah. But sometimes it's not about agreeing. It's about listening and learning." The other co-hosts nodded in agreement, chiming in with their own thoughts. One of them added, "It's refreshing to see someone stay calm under pressure. And honestly, she made some great points about hope and connection. Even if you don't believe in God, you can appreciate the humanity behind what she was saying." The audience erupted into applause, and Whoopi raised her hands in mock surrender. All right, don't get carried away," she joked. But seriously, props to her for handling herself so well. Not many people could have kept their cool like that. Back at home, Karoline watched the episode with a mix of pride and gratitude. Hearing Whoopi acknowledge her strength publicly meant more than she expected. It wasn't an endorsement of her beliefs, nor was it an apology for challenging her, but it was a sign of mutual respect, which was far more valuable. Over the following weeks, invitations started rolling in. Podcast hosts wanted to interview her. Church groups asked her to speak, and local community organizations invited her to lead discussions about faith and resilience. At first, she hesitated. She didn't want to come across as self-promotional or opportunistic. But eventually, she realized this was her chance to keep the conversation going. If her story could help even one person find strength in their darkest moments, then it was worth sharing. One evening, she found herself speaking to a packed auditorium at a small-town community center. As she stood on stage looking out at the sea of faces, she felt a wave of nerves wash over her. These weren't TV cameras or studio lights. These were real people, each carrying their own burdens and searching for answers. She took a deep breath and began to speak. "I didn't grow up thinking I'd end up on national television defending my faith," she admitted with a smile. "In fact, I spent most of my life questioning it myself. There were days when I felt completely lost, like nothing made sense anymore. But through those struggles, I learned something important. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting that there's light at the end of the tunnel, even when you can't see it yet." Her words resonated with the crowd, many of whom nodded along or wiped away tears. After the talk, dozens of people lined up to thank her, sharing their own stories of hardship and hope. One woman hugged her tightly, whispering, "You have no idea how much your words meant to me tonight. Thank you for reminding me that I'm not alone." As the months passed, Karoline continued to embrace opportunities to connect with others, whether it was through writing, speaking, or simply engaging in everyday conversations. She remained committed to fostering understanding and empathy. She knew that not everyone would agree with her views, and that was perfectly fine. What mattered was creating spaces where people felt safe to ask questions, express doubts, and seek truth in their own way. Years later, when reflecting on that fateful day on The View, Karoline couldn't help but smile. It hadn't been easy. In fact, it had been one of the most challenging experiences of her life, but it had also been one of the most rewarding. She often thought about Whoopi's parting words backstage. "Good job out there." Those 4 simple words had reminded her that even in disagreement, there's room for respect and growth. Looking back, Karoline realized that the true power of faith lies not in convincing others to believe what you believe, but in inspiring them to hold on to hope, kindness, and connection. And in a world full of noise and division, perhaps that was the most important message of all.